Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're glad to have you here at our first Rural Rental Housing Preservation Academy for the Pacific Northwest region. Excited to get started. Folks are coming into the room rapidly, and we will begin it promptly at 10:01, just to ensure that everybody can get fully logged into the meeting. Hello and welcome, everyone. We are continuing to get folks logging in. This is the Enterprise Rural Rental Housing Preservation Academy, focusing on the Pacific Northwest. And we will be starting very briefly, just as long as we get all of the participants logging in. We've got 100 of us on the call right now. It's lovely to see you all. Okay, it looks like the bulk of us have gotten in. I am Robin Wolf, and I am the Senior Program Director of Rural Housing at Enterprise Community Partners. And I am so excited to be inviting you and having you here as part of this session that we're bringing to really highlight the rural communities and preservation efforts being made in the Pacific Northwest region. We're highlighting here Washington, Oregon, and also inviting our friends in Idaho and Alaska to really learn more about the rural landscape, the kind of housing stock in their communities, and how preservation is working within those communities as well. I want to start this conversation out with a land acknowledgement, and to acknowledge that this conversation is coming to you from the traditional lands of the Arapaho and Cheyenne tribes. I want to pay my respect to the elders, both past and present, with an understanding that the maltreatment and neglect that has been inflicted on the Indigenous peoples of this place and across the continent. Native Americans have contributed so much culturally to the fabric of our nation and here to our state. I ask that we let this acknowledgement serve as an opening to greater awareness of Native sovereignty and cultural rights, and as a step toward more equitable relationship and reconciliation with our Indigenous communities. Please take a moment to consider and reflect the legacies of violence, displacement, and settlement that bring us together here today. In this way, we may embrace a new sense of connection, relation, and belonging to each other and to the spaces that we occupy. I encourage you all to acknowledge the land you occupy in the chat. I know many of you are in different traditional lands than I am, being as that we are cross-regional and virtual today. If you would like, we will share a link in the chat for you to look that up if you want to know more about that. As we do that, I will want to review the agenda and a few housekeeping notes. The best way to talk to us is through either the chat feature or there's also a raise hand function. And please be sure to use and utilize those functions as you move forward throughout the day. Today, we will have a couple of stops for questions and answers, and that's how I will be able to open up lines as needed if you want to ask questions directly. All participants who are here today will receive a copy of the webinar recording and of the PowerPoint slides. Please be patient with us as we continue to host in a virtual space. Sometimes there are technical difficulties as we communicate through what is the really wonder of the internet, but sometimes it can be cumbersome. I also want to be sure in that we acknowledge my colleague, Adrienne Norwood. She is always on our calls here and has been a tremendous support to the rural and native team as we've moved our training delivery to virtual, and will be helping me in all of the AV work today on this call and in supporting of all of this presentation. And I also want to acknowledge the Senior Director of the Rural and Native American Program Team and turn the stage over to Susan Anderson, who will give you a bit more context about Enterprise Community Partners.
Great. Thank you so much, Robin. And just want to offer a warm welcome to everyone on the call today and say good morning. Appreciate everyone putting in where they're located and the ancestral lands that they're on in the chat. Appreciate you participating in that. And again, thank you to Robin for all the great work and Adrian for her work in this as well. So I am Susan Anderson. I'm the Senior Director of the Rural and Native American Programs here at Enterprise Community Partners. And just wanted to share with you all who might not be familiar a little bit about Enterprise and who we are. We are a national nonprofit that have been working to address America's affordable housing needs and impending housing crisis over the last 40 years, working with literally thousands of partners on the ground, our local partners, and have a large employee base of over 1,000 employees nationally. We consider ourselves to be one of the earliest social enterprises and are a convener across numerous sectors, and our results have touched millions of lives, even though there's much more work to be done with communities and partners nationally. We've just undergone a new strategic planning process. So next slide, please, Robin, where we have our new vision and mission as of last September, where really we're centering housing as a home and a community as pillars in really advancing people's quality of life and thinking about more than just housing, but really centering it as a home. And so how do we do all this? Next slide, please. Want to, as I said, we sort of work across different angles. So the work that this team is on, our Rural Native American team, is really focused on the solutions of developing and deploying program and support and resources in partnership with organizations and communities on the ground. We also work on a policy level, both at the state and federal policy level. We invest capital both through tax credit syndication and through our community development financial institution, our loan fund. And we also, this is probably a little unknown fact, but we are an owner and operator of housing. We have a portfolio of over 13,000 affordable homes in the Mid-Atlantic region. And just to touch a little bit more on the Rural and Native American team, we work nationally to serve rural and Native communities. The Preservation Academy, which Robin leads, and she'll go much more into detail in that work today, but is a piece of those solutions. And we also have a programmatic focus supporting homeownership in Native communities and our Native partners as on rental housing as well, but really built around programming to build the capacity of our partners on the ground and help them with the preservation and development of affordable housing and meeting their community development needs. Next slide, please, Robin. I want to thank our partners in this work and our supporters. Without them, programming like this would not be possible. So thank you to Fatty Mae, Oregon Housing and Community Services, the Collins Foundation, and JP Morgan Chase. I also want to extend our thanks to USDA Rural Development Multifamily Office and staff, the Washington Department of Commerce and Washington State Housing Finance Commission, ORF, the Office of Rural and Farm Worker Housing, and their partnership, and all of those who've talked with us in preparation for this academy. And with that, it's with deep pleasure that I get to introduce to you Cecile Chalafour, the Western Region Manager of Community Development Banking at JP Morgan Chase. It's truly an honor and a pleasure. Cecile is a blast from my past, and I think demonstration of sometimes how small the affordable housing world is. But again, Cecile's the Western Division Manager at JP Morgan Chase, and prior was the Director of the California region at Low Income Investment Fund, and brings over 20 years of affordable housing experience to JP Morgan Chase. So thank you, Cecile, for your support in this work. And I just want to hand it over to you to say a few words. So thank you.
Thank you, Susan, and you're right. Very nice memories from the past. We did fantastic work together, all in service of affordable housing in various communities around the West. I very much appreciate your point. Thank you all for joining us today. As Susan mentioned, my name is Cecile Chalifo, and I serve as the West Division Manager for Community Development Banking for JP Morgan Chase, which means pretty much our affordable housing platform. And we are very active in all regions, all markets around the state, including rural communities, and it's a deep commitment for JP Morgan Chase to keep serving your communities. On behalf of my colleagues across the region, I want to express our appreciation for all of you and for your enthusiasm for the launch of the Rural Rental Housing Preservation Academy in the Pacific Northwest. At Chase, we believe affordable housing for individuals and families, along with access to economic opportunities and services, are the cornerstone of vibrant and resilient neighborhood. And that's why we committed $2 billion over the next 5 years to increase funding for the construction and the preservation of affordable housing for moderate and low income households nationwide. Again, I want to emphasize, it does include communities that have disparately impacted by the recession, by the pandemic, by the long-term affordable housing crisis, meaning rural communities. With that, we're thrilled to support enterprise community partners and the expansion of the Academy in your region. And we look forward to working with all of you on this important work in the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cecile, and to all of our partners. As Susan mentioned, this work has been really a long time coming. We have been working on bringing the Preservation Academy to the Pacific Northwest region for at least the last 18 months, putting a lot of time and energy to making sure that the voices of your communities are heard in this process, and that what we're presenting is really of value to you and your communities. So I'm going to start deep dive into the meat of why we're doing this, and give a little bit more context. And then later in the session, as I revealed on the agenda, we will get to hear from folks at Washington State, the Department of Commerce, then also OHCS and the USDA multifamily housing team. So really excited for what we have in store for you today. But the first question, and that I get asked often in my work, is why preservation? There's a lot of reasons for this, but here are the kind of high-level reasons for why preservation is important to us here at Enterprise and to really affordable housing communities and those who are interested in affordable housing on the whole. It tends to cost less than new construction. We can get into some conversations about this as we get into case studies, depending upon deferred maintenance and things. It prevents displacement, meaning that we have a lot of folks who are low income who live in housing that is at risk. And when that housing at risk goes to the market or gets condemned or closed down for some other reason, the people who live there are displaced. Elaborating on that, many of those are seniors and people with disabilities, particularly as we look at subsidized stock like 515 or HUD 202 and 811. Preservation keeps valuable subsidies in state. As I mentioned, the programs like USDA 515 and HUD 202 and 811 programs all come with project-based subsidies. Should those projects fall out of service, those subsidies can get lost with those developments. It avoids NIMBYism. When you build something new, often you have to face this not in my backyard sort of mentality as you go through town council, city council meetings, approval. Preservation is simply preserving something that is already in service for a low income targeted population, and therefore you don't face the same kinds of arguments, or you don't tend to face those same kinds of arguments as you're doing this work. The next question is, what do you mean by rural? And this is a complicated question. Actually, I was just reading a study, recently reading a study from the Brookings Institute, and many different federal and state agencies. There are at least like, I think 11 different definitions just from funders on the state and federal level for what rural is. But right now, what we're targeting or talking about as rural are these kind of lighter orange. Under 50,000 is the lightest orange, and that is generally what we're considering as rural, and that is under 50,000 in population. That's like 20% of America, or 1 in 5 Americans is rural based, and so 60 million folks as far as the 2010 census, and that is a really profound number. I think that often that doesn't come across. You can see also specifically what is rural within your state in this. And that next slide. Why rural? Rural is really important because poverty is and remains a challenge in many rural communities. There are 473 persistent poverty counties as identified through the definition by the CDFI, and most of those are rural. The USDA Section 515 program is the largest federal affordable rental housing program in these communities, and a lot of that portfolio is at risk of losing restriction and rental assistance. LIHTC is not often meeting rural communities at the same rate that it meets our metro communities, and that has there's a lot of reasons for that. Has to do with size, scale, incomes, cost of construction, and then the rental market in general. This is a diagram of showing us what affordable rural housing is at risk. This is of the actual 515 program. You will see we are in 2020, kind of in this first build up stage, or 2021, excuse me, I've forgotten what year I'm in. And 2028 is the beginning of this first peak. We always start to see a lot more units that are coming into expiration. There are several factors that are placing these units at risk. Much of the housing stock that was developed under the 515 program is over 30 years old and needs rehab and recapitalization. Many of these units also need to be modified for things like ADA compliance. Tenants living in these units, many of them receive RA, and they will be very hard hit if these developments go out of service for the targeted subsidized population, considering the average income in a subsidized USDA RD unit is about $13,000 annually. Here's another way to look at kind of the overlap of where the rural and subsidized housing exists. You'll see that the slide has LIHTC Section 8 and also USDA, public housing, and multiple. Multiple is red, so some of those could be have home dollars in it, for example, plus a LIHTC, or home plus RD. The orange ones are RD only. The purple are LIHTC, so you will see the concentrations, of course, around metro areas, but you will also see that there are many of these properties in rural communities in the states where we work. This data is taken from the National Housing Preservation Database, which is really helpful as we look at these graphic kind of interpretations. But some of this data is lacking, and this is part of what we want to talk about as we go through the academy about how to kind of really work through and to get better data so that we can really hone in on the properties that we want to preserve. So rural communities here, meaning in the Pacific Northwest region, are significantly cost burdened. There's the analysis of the ACS data, the American Community Survey data, states that 47% of non-metro renters in both Oregon and Washington are cost burdened. This is really high and sort of debunks the myth that a lot of us have in place, or many have in place, that housing in rural America is more affordable. This number is really not that far off of how many are cost burdened living in a metro area like Portland or Seattle. Maybe that's like 50%, but like we're very close in the rural community. So people who live in rural communities are facing cost burden for housing in the same way that, that they are in metro communities, and large percentages, nearly half of the population, are cost burdened by their housing. I think this is a really profound number for the states of Washington and Oregon. Many other states will see it over 30%, but 47% is particularly high. The percentages will only worsen if we continue to lose housing and service to low-income communities through expiration or depreciation, or being lost to the market. And this is, again, coming back to why the preservation of these units is so important. Of course, it's important to build new units as well, but we cannot actually build enough units to replace the amount that are at risk. So we've got to make sure we find solutions on both sides of this coin. Let's get into exactly what we're working on here together at the Pacific Northwest Rural Preservation Academy. This is going to be a series of no-cost training and peer learning sessions that's designed to help housing providers, nonprofits, state agencies work together to find new solutions to acquire and or preserve affordable housing in rural communities. We want to build the capacity of affordable developers to do this work. And our ultimate goal is to preserve affordable housing options for low-income rural populations. This is supplemented by a technical assistance cohort, which provides peer learning and support networks for nonprofit owners and operators, and also public housing authorities. We are so excited to be working with this cohort in concert with the Academy sessions that are open to all. This gives us a time to really cross-pollinate ideas. The regional approach will be very different because many folks have worked with others in their state, but maybe not in the neighboring state, even though they're both serving maybe the same specific population like farm workers. So it gives chance for new ideas to be cross-pollinated. It also makes sense to work regionally right now as we talk through the USDA multifamily regional alignment, which Eric, who's one of our speakers later today, we'll get to a bit as well. The Academy series was launched in Texas in 2018. Last year, we hosted in Colorado, and this is our year. This is our first year for a regional approach, so we're very excited about that. I also really want to acknowledge how strong our TA cohort is and how inspired I am about the work they're doing, and really looking forward to working with them one-on-one to make some closer relationships and to really get into those projects. I also want to acknowledge that with this work, we are engaging ORF, the Office of Rural and Farm Worker Housing, which is based in Washington and led by Marty Miller, and Larry Anderson of Get RD Done Right as our consultants in this process. You will get to meet folks from ORF and Larry next week as part of our deeper session into USDA housing stock. This is a bit of the framework for where we come from with how we've scheduled our sessions for the Preservation Academy. First, looking at the identification of homes, then at pre-development, acquisition, rehab, and then stewardship. Stewardship for us also includes just ongoing ownership, but not only ongoing ownership and property management, but really working about community engagement and resident services as well, which is very key to us in successful program operation. Here are the sessions that you can expect. We are currently in the overview and introduction to rural housing preservation, and talking specifically in our region. We will have a few more sessions in this space. 515 in the 538 transfer process, case studies in this work, and then talking about other federal and state housing finance programs that are not USDA RD related. We'll then dive into deal structuring and financial modeling with pro forma development, gap financing, really an in-depth conversation. And this is a new session for this year, which I'm really excited about, getting into the capital needs assessment, architects, and scope of work that are needed for rehab projects, as that work can be very challenging to get into and really specific. So giving some good best practices there. And then we will have a specific cohort breakout where we do sort of a study session just with our TA cohort on that 538 transfer process, which can be pretty complicated. We'll also have some sessions related to property management and community engagement. And not on this list, but also very important is local policy, which is a huge part of really working with our local communities. How can they promote housing preservation? What are tools that they can put into their toolbox to help ensure that the properties that exist within their communities can stay within their communities? So that is one other session that will be part of this academy, not included. And really just to kind of wrap up this conversation and to move into detailed conversations in each state. The question came up at our first cohort convening: what word comes to mind when you think about rural housing preservation in your community or as you're part of your work? And here is kind of just a visual interpretation of the words that came up for folks: critical, headaches, difficult, opportunity, redemption, expensive. All are really, I think, key to see that there's both hope and there's both a little bit of heartache as we go through this work and we embark upon these conversations. I think critical it stands out visually to us here and is really hits home that this is a very important work that we're gathered here to do in concert together. And I'm really excited to be part of it and to be able to do that in partnership with not only the groups and the providers, but also with agencies like the Washington State Department of Commerce. And so with that, I am going to turn over to Karina Grigoris. I hope I said that right, Karina. And Karina is the Deputy Assistant Director of Community Services and Housing at the Washington Department of Commerce. This division partners with local governments, community-based nonprofits, tribes, housing authorities, and others to promote individual and family self-sufficiency, develop and preserve affordable housing, reduce homelessness, address the causes of effects of crime and violence, and invest in community facilities. So a lot going on in this division, and Karina provides executive leadership for that work and across the agency, and guides and manages the internal operations within the division. Karina was previously the managing director for the Housing Finance Unit, and in that role, she was responsible for making strategic statewide investments to develop new housing for low-income and special needs populations, and as well as overseeing a $1.3 billion portfolio in over 55,000 housing units. So Karina, thank you for joining us. We are going to do a transfer of slides, so bear with us for a second. Adrian, facilitate your slides. And again, welcome.
Thank you very much. Perfect. Thank you. So all you have heard that's just done in the Community and Services Housing Division. Wait until you hear what Commerce is doing. If you can move to the next slide, I would really appreciate that. So Commerce is really the one agency that is focused on strengthening communities, and we touch every aspect of community and economic development in our state, from planning to infrastructure, energy, public facilities, housing and homelessness, as you heard, public safety, international trade, commerce, business service, and so much more. At any point in time, Commerce is administering anywhere between 100 and 120 programs. So you can imagine we are a very busy agency, although on the small side, we're about 350 employees. If you can go to the next slide. Thank you. So for the Housing Trust Fund, this is what you heard the intro talk about me managing the program for the past 5.5 years or so, and it has been a pleasure and a privilege to do all that work, and it has been a really roller coaster with huge investments made by the legislature and the governor in the last few years, a lot of good work that's been happening in our state. And I know there are a few folks right now in the participants who are from out of state. So just a quick overview to give you a sense of the program. It's been enacted 35 years ago. It's funded with bonds through our capital budgets. So we obviously depend on the legislative process every year, every biennium, and we expect appropriations of every biennium to make new awards. We administer an annual competitive funding round, I should say at least one annual competitive funding round, as you'll hear later. Our typical recipients are nonprofits, housing authorities, tribes, and local governments. We coordinate projects really closely with other public funders, cities and counties, and with the local communities, as well as the Housing Finance Commission on the tax credit programs that they administer. All of our projects or investments must benefit low-income population that is less than 80% of the area median income. And that includes rental tenants, permanent supportive housing folks, shelters, first-time home buyers, typically anyone who is low income. And properties once invested in by the program are rent and income restricted for 40 or 50 years. In the case of when we make investments in home ownership programs, they are restricted for 25 years. Next slide, please. At a glance, this is where we are right now. We have made investments in every county. We have 39 counties in Washington, and we have investments in every county. About 1.2, 1.3 roughly $billion invested to date, 55 million units that we are really focused on preserving. About half of our households are really serving people with special needs. 75% of the households, if you look from a different perspective, are serving people that are extremely low income. And at any point in time, we're estimating we are benefiting about 90,000 people or more. And historically, we have been able to leverage funding from other sources like private and public. And on an average, I want to say about $5 to 1. Next slide, please. Thank you. Our competitive funding criteria, it's established in statute, and then we also have quite a few requirements in our budget appropriations. So you would see our typical rounds changing sometimes from year to year, depending on what the flavor of the funds are, if you will. However, we have a geographic distribution requirement with a 30% target investments into rural communities. And overall, we try as best as we can to make our competitive awards about a third in rural, a third in King County, and a third in other urban areas outside of King County. We look at, like every other funder, we look at project readiness, site control, permits, zoning. Full funding is important because we want to be able to fund projects that are ready to go. Population served tends to be a target and a priority for the legislature, especially in the last several biennia it has been. So that has played a big role in how we made the words. And like I mentioned earlier, we coordinate really closely with other public funders, and we do that towards the end of our decision-making process prior to making awards. We look at costs and leverage and all kinds of requirements. Next slide, please. It's interesting that I did hear, what Robin was presenting earlier about rural definition, and we at Department of Commerce took a really close look at our rural definition. We are required in statute to define rural because of our 30% target. And right now, our definition, which is right now on the screen, it's defined in our policies, which we call the Housing Trust Fund Handbook. And typically, towns or localities with 25,000 or less population would fall under rural. There are a few exceptions, as you can see there, and those happen every now and then in our funding rounds. But we need to have the definition. We quite recently actually met with stakeholders and reviewed all of the rural definitions that we were able to find and compared and contrasted. And we came back with these being probably the best suited definition for the trust fund at this time. Next slide, please. So why I'm here today, I know this training today is mostly about preservation, but the trust fund is about both, creating new development as well as preserving, and both are really, really important. And what we started to observe as a team and as a community is a difficulty in reaching that 30% to rural target. And most likely it was because we would receive insufficient or unsuitable rural applications. We noticed, of course, that small rural housing providers lack the capacity to develop or the capacity to maintain these properties long-term like we would expect them to. There is a great need for technical assistance and pre-development consultation and some funding for pre-development activities, pre-construction activities. And we thought this was a great opportunity for us to reevaluate how we look at our application process and how we fund projects and see if there is anything that we can help to remove any criteria that was resulting in unintended consequences. And again, as I mentioned earlier, it's really important for us here at the state to keep an eye on both new development and preservation. Next slide, please. Thank you. This is to give folks a sense of applications received. The next slide is going to show you applications that we awarded. As you can tell, over the last 3 years, we've received anywhere between 17% and 31% in rural. It is an improvement, but it's still not enough if you compare to everything else that's coming in the round. The next slide will show awards made. And if you notice, we are really striving to hit the target or exceed it if possible. Even in years like in 2018, when we received 17%, we ended up making awards to rural projects 26%. Last year, most recently in December, we were able to really exceed our target. So we're really happy to see that we have more applications coming into the round. Next slide. It was very important for us to engage the community. We are consulting with a group that's called the Policy Advisory Team. They are a formal subcommittee of a governor-appointed Affordable Housing Advisory Board. And the Policy Advisory Team, or PAT for short, is solely focused on trust fund. We have been meeting with these folks for many, many years on a quarterly basis. These are public meetings, and these are the folks that know the program and that have been engaged with the program for many years and have the experience in the ground of developing and managing these projects. So we dedicated one of those quarterly meetings solely to discussing and brainstorming how we can encourage more development and preservation in rural areas of the state. We also sent out a survey to folks so that we are making sure to reach out to everyone. We have a really large distribution list, and we got some really good information there. And we formed a, quote unquote, rural subcommittee so that we can really dive deep into the issues. And what we did, we reviewed and compared the definition, like I mentioned earlier, and we came back with practically keeping the definition as we had it, at least for now. We sifted through all of that brainstorming ideas that we had at the Policy Advisory Team. That was back in, I want to say December 2019. We analyzed our competitive application evaluation criteria, and then we came up with a list of implementable steps. And we categorize those in 3 areas: actions that are implementable at the program's discretion right now or in the next, in the upcoming months. Some actions that are still implementable but may need funding or legislation or both. And then there were quite a few actions that were not really in our purview. Not that they're not important, but we tried, to go to the low-hanging fruit, if you will. And to give you a few examples of what those last actions would have been: zoning issues, NIMBYism, let's see, community support and educate the communities and all that. Again, not that they're not important, but we felt like we wanted to tackle the first 2 first. And I think the next slide is going to talk a little bit about what we have done and what's underway. And we are really on a journey here. This is not something that's going to end. We have been able to increase our share of annual awards. So we made an intentional effort to do that. As the last funding round shows, we were able to finance about 40-something percent, 44% of our funds into rural properties, which is amazing. We were able to do that by making some deeper investments in a few projects that were not able to secure tax credits. Going back to the discussions we've been having with the communities, that's what we learned. Many projects in those areas are just not able to secure tax credits. It's just not doable. And in that case, is the state able to step in and make a deeper investments? And we have done that on a few projects. We increased the award limits, and this is moving forward. As well as in the last couple of rounds. And we added just now, recently, we added a waiver for rural projects only. Because we're a statewide program, we have a requirement of statewide distribution of funds. So we always have had some sort of award limits in place. So we want to make some exceptions for rural projects that are in areas that have been underserved by the Housing Trust Fund program. We have a portfolio preservation program that is aimed at preserving properties already in our portfolio, and it has been pretty successful over the last 2 or 3 years. When we looked at our application review, as you heard me talk about earlier, we tried to remove some of those unintended consequences. So we suspended scoring criteria in rural projects for investment per unit or leverage of other funds. As I mentioned, some of these projects need a deeper state investments. And if you were to look at state investment per unit, those projects clearly would not score as well. So we suspended that scoring criteria for rural projects. What we also heard from the community is that all those population set asides that are typically required of us in the appropriations, in the budgetary appropriations, have been a deterrent for folks in rural areas, that they can't develop and fund projects for, let's say, permanent supportive housing or certain populations that were a top priority for the legislature. So we made it really clear in our application materials that rural projects only compete against rural projects. And if rural projects don't seek to develop housing for special population set aside, that is okay, because they would only compete against each other. We can't completely remove that because it's in our legislation, but we can make it clear on how it's applied, and it should not be a deterrent. We worked really hard with the Housing Finance Commission to align our timelines, and I think last year has been extremely helpful for the 9% tax credit application round to be due around the same time as the trust fund was. And we submitted some bold requirements to the governor. We asked for $250 million in capital investment. And we also asked for $2 million for technical assistance and pre-development funding that seemed to be at the top of the list of the most wanted items, if you will, for our community. Next slide, please. So moving forward, we are committed to continue to uphold all this progress we made and the policies that encourage rural applications. We are just about to reconvene that rural subcommittee. We are holding tight now as the legislature is wrestling with our budgets, and we think we are going to see the $2 million in there that will be included for technical assistance to go in the community, work with the community. We have already drafted the RFP for that, so we are ready to hit to release it once we have the funds. And again, getting together with the subcommittee, we just want to make sure that we are defining success together, and that we will be able to look at successful applications coming online and coming in the funding round and being funded, and then units coming online. And again, focus is to preserve and build more rural housing. And I think I have one more slide. Thank you. I wanted to leave you all with this great story. In the last legislative session, we received $10 million solely focused on preserving properties at risk of losing affordability, with a particular focus in rural. So just within 4 months, we were able to create a new special funding round, if you will, solicit applications and award $12 million to 7 rural projects. All of them were in the rural area. All of them were able to are able to preserve 150 units and remain affordable for another 40 years from the time we signed those contracts. And 106 of those units will maintain their USD rental assistance. It looks like we're going to get another special appropriation like this in this legislative session right now, and we can't wait to roll that out. So I think I'll stop here and see if folks have any questions for us.
Thank you, Karina. We do have a couple of questions. One actually, I think probably comes up from during my conversation about the definition of rural and how firm is the definition of rural. Enterprise, our definition of rural is flexible, recognizing that different states and different agencies, federal agencies have different definitions of rural. So it depends on which funding source you might be working with or bringing to bear for technical assistance or to support pass-through funding for capital needs assessment. It seems like, Karina, you've done a lot of work with this question, I think, from your presentation. So I wonder if there's other, you might have something else to kind of share about that, or I think you pretty much answered that during your presentation. And like I said, I feel it was probably asked more about my ambiguous definition of rural with my map of light orange versus white. But I do know, maybe you could speak a little bit, Karina, how like this probably posed a challenge that you weren't expecting when you first created a set aside for rural.
Well, I think the set aside for rural has been in our statute for quite a while. It has been really difficult to reach that target. It's somewhat of a soft target. I mean, the statute says that if we don't have enough suitable applications, of course, we can fund other projects. We wouldn't leave money on the table. But we have been struggling to reach the target. And that's why, we started having those discussions in late 2019 and over 2020. And like your assessment, we did take a really close look at the definition of rural, and we had that group looking at it together. We found other definitions like the USDA definition that is pretty complicated with a map attached, if you will. We looked at the definition that the Housing Finance Commission here in our state is using, and they're using the same definition. However, their allocation geographic pools are differently defined. So we've been working on that. I don't think it's perfect, and I think it's still up for discussion if we need to. We are required to have a definition, so we cannot have it. So we kind of landed on the same one that we have been having. I don't know if that's really answering your question, but yeah, it's been a focus of ours as well.
That's great, Karina. There is a follow-up question on this. Steve Williams asks, he's on the board of a provider in Spokane, and they have many rural projects. And the question is, are you looking at the rural headquarters of an organization or the actual location of a project when you're considering rural investment?
Location of a project.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
and the community in which it will be developed or preserved.
Great. That makes most sense to me. So Steve, I hope that answered your question. And if you would like more follow-up, let me know. Then I did have, there's a few in chat I want to make sure I've got. we're Marty Miller at ORF, and it's just saying that the preservation investment by Washington State has been really tremendous, that $12 million, and really appreciative of that, that direct investment in those 7 projects.
Yeah.
And
if you notice, the appropriation was 10 million. We just added another 2.5 almost million from our flexible funding, because they were just 2 great projects to pass over.
That's fantastic that you're able to do that. I do think that that's what's really valuable about us being able to deliver this conversation in a regional perspective, is our, our friends who might be listening in from Idaho or Alaska or Oregon can see, okay, what can we do? Okay, this is one example that's being done in another state. Here's some things that have come up, definitions of rural, and this allows us to sort of cross-pollinate ideas as we have folks from OHCS on the call later, and different housing finance agencies on the call. So it's helpful to really cross-pollinate, and then as a national representative to really think as we even more broadly about what could be best practices to ensure investment in rural communities. There's a question about when does the 2021 RFP for Housing Trust Funds scheduled to be released, and what is the department's timeline there?
So I'm trying to read between the lines. So the RFP I mentioned earlier, that is for technical assistance in the community. Our hope is to hire a few development consultants to go and work with the communities and start pre-developing projects. And that will be released once we have assurance that we have the administrative money. So that's operating money, not capital. Now, the question may be about our funding rounds, and we call those Notice of Funding Availabilities, or NOFA for short. We will likely release those in June, July, once we have final budgets, and they typically are effective July 1st. Some of them may be on a faster track. So it all depends on the capital budget appropriations. Right now, at this point, we have awarded everything we've had available from the current biennium.
Fantastic. There is a comment that the investment at $80,000 per home is really a wonderful level, but can that level be sustained as more projects are becoming ready to apply for those dollars? And then kind of shows the envelope math to get to $80,000 per unit. So I guess the question is, can that level of investment be sustained?
Well,
ongoing?
It depends. It's usually when we make new investments, we are anywhere between 50 and 100,000 per unit. This particular NOFA, or Notice of Funding Availability, for the rural preservation was unique, and it was indeed just preservation alone. So it depends if you are helping develop or if you are helping preserving, and more so, it also depends on the location. In rural projects, as I mentioned earlier, we tend to make deeper investments. So our cost per unit, if you will, it's usually higher. In very urban areas, we tend to make smaller investments per unit because there are other resources, tax credits or local funding available, private investment, if you will, and whatnot. So in those urban areas, like up and down the I-5 corridor, you would see that our the trust fund investment per unit is much smaller. But on an average, we are typically between 50 and 100,000 overall.
Okay, great. And then there's a question, was there a common characteristic for the 7 projects selected? And will you be looking for that commonality again, if there were?
Yeah, definitely. It was clearly targeted to projects at risk at losing their affordability. And the USDA properties in which their loans are being prepaid or expiring or whatnot, those are the best candidate for that kind of funding round. So that was the top characteristics. And then we also looked at projects that were able to preserve that rental assistance from USDA. That's why I mentioned that was one of the criteria that we looked at.
So losing their restrictions and also losing the subsidy.
Exactly. So hopefully we can replace those restrictions with the public investment. And that way the subsidy can stay with the project as well for the long term.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, any other questions at this time for Karina? And as I don't see any, I really want to thank you, Karina, for your time and your support and conversation that we've had over the several months in preparation for this. And we think the work that you're doing right now at the Department of Commerce is really tremendous in terms of really highlighting the need for both rural investment, but and then even looking specifically at preservation as a need in our rural communities. So really appreciative of that and excited to have some projects that will be moving forward with technical assistance on in partnership with some of those dollars. So all very exciting. Want to really thank you for being here as a speaker. And I am going to give us all a 4-minute break in between. I think it's important for us to have time to check our emails and move away and grab a cup of coffee or a glass of water, just so that we can be prepared and come back after the break. We will listen to Natasha Detweiler-Davy from OHCS, and then Eric Stevens from USDA Multifamily Housing Team. So please join us back at the break promptly at 11 o'clock. Thank you. Welcome back. I hope you all got a little bit of a break, not a tremendous one, a little bit of one, and welcome you to the second part of our first session on the housing landscape in the Pacific Northwest. We got a chance to hear about what is happening in Washington State and a little bit about what's happening more broadly across the country around rural housing preservation in the first hour. And that this time we're going to hear from Natasha Detweiler-Davy. She's the Assistant Director of Planning and Policy, affordable rental housing at Oregon Housing and Community Services. And I am looking for my notes to introduce her right now. And Natasha comes with a wealth of experience in this space and works on areas related directly to affordable housing preservation and development, and internal and external communication around those issues at the state of Oregon. And with no further ado, I will turn the stage over to Natasha. Natasha, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you great.
Great. So yeah, thanks for having me. I think I'll just do a kind of brief overview of where we are in terms of preservation in rural Oregon at this point in time, and then open for questions. Then we can just go into the next slide. And so I think, like, probably all of the different regions are talking about preservation has several different faces for us. We certainly have a concerted interest and attention toward the expiration of affordability restrictions, where we have project-based rent portfolio from RD and HUD attached to it. But we also have extensive portfolio of tax credit project and gap funded portfolio as well. And so those are more what we would consider like our portfolio preservation needs. I think Oregon, unlike some states, we are both the tax credit allocator as well as the gap funder. So we have kind of the full gambit of full spectrum of affordable rental housing within our portfolio. And then that need for those expiring projects and the investment in those is then juxtaposed with the risk of expiration, risk of loss due to physical deterioration, deferred maintenance. And given some market conditions, sometimes there's the risk of loss just for conversion to market. But I think what we're seeing more and more these days is that, again, the expiration due to the affordability restrictions, which starts to get interest for some areas of the state. And then those projects that aren't at their end of their affordability period, but are facing need for substantial rehabilitation in order to keep them viable. As a state, we have required for, let's see, 4% projects only are usually a 30-year affordability period, but other projects with gap funding and 9% credits have a 60-year affordability period that is attached to them. And I think, challenges in rural Oregon, I didn't get incredibly detailed here, but I think that there's, both the number of folks that are interested in taking on those assets, in particular for some of our older portfolio of HUD and RD projects, and I guess to a lesser extent tax credit, but we have aging owners who are not interested in continuing to own and operate those themselves, and so are looking for someone to buy them out and take over those projects. So finding adequate capacity and interest in all cases is at times a challenge. In particular, when you're talking about smaller projects, when there's, to really get the right economy of scale, you want to have a lot of times there's a need to have the larger presence of units within there to incentivize in the right way. And so we do see a fair bit of, doing a portfolio transaction where you're financing a bundle of several different properties together. And those may be spread across rural Oregon. And then you know, the significant cost associated, and some of our urban areas in particular, and you know, the Portland metro area have other resources available to help subsidize and further help support the investment in those properties. And that's something that is generally not available in rural Oregon. And then income levels are the AMI levels are lower, and so getting those to pencil is oftentimes harder, as well as just having an aging housing stock. Go to the next slide. And so in terms of Oregon Housing and Community Services, we, in our statewide housing plan, which is our strategic planning document, rural communities and community investment is one of the 6 policy priority areas within there. And so and tied with affordable rental housing is certainly goals and targeted efforts toward increasing investments in rural Oregon, increasing the number of new and preserved units that we are able to get within them. And I guess, you know, in terms of preservation really globally, I think part of what we find is that the price tag for that all is really significant and at odds with the fact that we are for a couple of years now in a housing crisis in terms of there not being adequate supply within any really in any housing group. And so needing to both ramp up production of new units as well as preserve existing units is incredibly important. And so really trying to figure out how we blend and allocate resources to be most effective towards that is essentially the perpetual challenge that we're up against. Rural Oregon, though, is certainly a policy priority, again, through that statewide housing plan and otherwise. And so I just listed here just several of the ways that that's reflected in terms of our funding efforts. And this isn't necessarily specific to preservation, but just in terms of having that rural lens. So our LIFT program, which is a local innovation and fast track housing program, targets half of its resources to rural areas of the state. And I was a little bit late entering, but I did hear part of the conversation around the definitions of how is it you define rural Oregon. At this point in time, I mean, we've been here, there, and everywhere, I think, like most places, but the definition that we have most consistently rely upon is really an adaptation of the USDA definition, which has, is a little more nuanced than a county level or a jurisdiction level. And so it is, and I pulled it up to make sure I had it right, but so within counties that are designated as metropolitan statistical areas, rural communities are those that would have less than 15,000 people in them. And for the counties where that are not classified as metropolitan statistical areas, we consider rural to be communities, jurisdictions with less than 40,000 people to them. And that's been relatively good, except that as populations change and shift, it's hard to really reconceptualize that and apply those in a different way. So I think that it's been several years since we defined that and put that into being in conjunction with our state's Housing Stability Council. And so I think that is going to be a conversation that will be refreshing within the next year to make sure that we're, aligning to today and potentially inflating some of those population markers. I would say, anecdotally, it works pretty well, except for in a handful of communities. And in those handful of communities, it is a pressure point to think about some of those jurisdictions that, really do reflect really a rural sentiment, but show up in an MSA and have 20,000 people. So it always is difficult to draw those lines. But in terms of that, we do, and so that's the definition for the rural, that targets half of the LIFT resources, which on a per capita basis is a higher percentage of resources to rural than would be demanded just by population distribution. And our 9% tax credit NOFA, we have established a new specific targeted region for rural. So we have, our balance of state, which is balance of state regions that are not direct home recipients, and have further divided that to have a region that's specifically rural areas in the balance of state where we allocate our home resources as well. And that has been a move made really with encouragement by rural stakeholders wanting to ensure that they were getting their fair share of that really competitive resource. We've also in our last QIP update added in a 10% set aside for development on tribal trust land. We have a land acquisition program, which can be used for both affordable rental, housing development, land purchase, as well as homeownership development. And it's a patient capital program where you can purchase the property before you have all of the plans in place. And we essentially expect that loan would remain outstanding for somewhere between 5 to 8 years. And as we've gotten resources for it in the past, we've been able to put that out and essentially have it earmarked and flagged just for use in rural areas for the first 12 months that we have those funds available. And then after that point in time would make them available on a statewide basis. And then we do have a small project NOFA that we fund through we have some document recording fee resources and other gap funding that we are able to put to projects, and we allocate the majority, I believe around 70% of those resources to be focused on rural areas. Go to the next slide. And then I guess, in terms of other than just set asides, we've also worked to customize several of our program kind of parameters to better serve rural areas. And this is always a growing need, a kind of evolving question, but kind of as a snapshot in our most recent information, our home program, which again, we serve the whole balance of state, but we are specifically prioritizing giving a 5-point preference to projects that are located actually in the rural areas of our balance of state. Our tax credit program has a state basis boost to specifically allow that 30% boost in rural areas, and has several of the scoring methods and criteria laid out differently for rural versus urban projects to be more reflective of what is in close proximity and those types of aspects. And then we do, with our 9% tax credit program, we do offer some gap resources and have a higher project cap for that in rural areas than within our urban centers. Our LIFT program, again, which has half of the resources going to rural areas, we've included a higher per bedroom subsidy limit in rural areas versus urban. And then in that small project NOFA, which is really targeted towards rural, again, implementing a higher per bedroom limit. And we're also working to align that with we have an agricultural workforce housing tax credit, which is largely used in rural areas, so that we're hoping that is a further means to drive towards that production in rural Oregon. Next slide. We also have capacity building efforts, which I'll say, a lot of that has been sidelines in terms of COVID. But we do have an ongoing permanent supportive housing institute where we hold specific places for those projects that are located and have project teams coming from rural areas, including back when we met in person in particular, covering travel and lodging for those that needed to travel to, I guess we were in the Salem area to participate in those trainings. While being remote, we're similarly able to help offset any costs of incurred technology to be able to participate in those. When COVID occurred and all the lockdown, we did use some of our capacity resources to fund a rural and culturally a capacity response for rural and culturally specific organizations, for housing in particular, to help facilitate that remote work under COVID. And so that was able to, was a little slow in the uptake, but was able to fully subscribe those resources to help, pay for all of the infrastructure that needs to be set up to be able to do remote work. And then we, with an eye towards preservation, became one of the sponsors for this Preservation Academy. Next slide. And so specific to preservation, I want to say it was 4 years ago or so, established the publicly supported housing preservation regulations, which was commonly referred to as House Bill 2002. And I know that bill name better than the statute that it actually lives under at this point in time. But essentially, it's complex, a series of regulations, which essentially ends up with three things. That you'll end up within that requires public noticing for properties that are approaching expiration. So there's noticing required at both 3 years and 2 years out, so that the state and the local jurisdiction are made aware of whether the owner is intending to opt out of renewing that affordability, basically to be able to monitor where we want to be directing folks toward purchasing. It allows the state to identify designees to have rights of first refusal to purchase a property. In addition, jurisdictions and housing authorities would be able to have that direct right of first refusal as well. And then we also became a good driver for maintaining an inventory of properties and expiration. And so we do have kind of in development different dashboards. We have a lot of kind of really detailed tracking of all of our portfolio properties and their related expiration dates. We have full-time program staff who works on kind of tracking all of that, being in touch with the owners, and making sure that we get those public noticing that are required, as well as understanding where there is an opportunity, where there will be an opportunity to purchase. We are standing up that designee process, and so we're through third-party CDFI, who's been really involved in preservation in Oregon, to help build that list of when we are in a place where we need to identify a designee that might be interested in purchasing a property, that we can relay that right of first refusal to. So they're helping us set up that infrastructure across the state to make sure we are have that application and the list of properties really ready. That there haven't been too many. So by the time, like I said, I think this is 3 or 4 years behind, and the ones that we have the rights for are able to be kind of keyed in real time now. And so that's where we're starting to see that. I think at the same time as all of this noticing is really important, we're also really, in a very candid way, if you don't have money to support the purchases, that's a problem in and of itself. And so this has been a tremendous first and second step, but what really remains to be seen are the resources. And so let's go to the next slide. And so in terms of resources, we again have kind of trying to do all of the things in terms of funding new construction and preservation. And so we traditionally, meaning in recent times, we've developed biennial, so 2-year funding calendars. The legislature in this last biennium, so from 19 through 21 fiscal years, had allocated to the state 20 million in lottery-backed bond proceeds to support preservation. And unfortunately, because of COVID, those were swept. So those were repurposed resources from the state. And so we lost that resource kind of halfway through our biennial calendar. So in 2020, we were able to offer 10 million in our own gap funding resources. But in 2021, we were planning to offer that 20 million in lottery-backed bonds and lost that opportunity, which has been relatively devastating in terms of our ability to, in real time, support the growing need for preservation. That being said, we've tried to pivot as much as we possibly can. We still, we had to cancel our planned 2021 preservation NOFA because of that loss in resources. We are continuing to, we do have within our approved budget with the legislature, with the governor at least. So we'll be going through the legislative process now to be able to get resources for this coming biennium of 2021 to 2023. So we're excited to be able to have that resource renewed and reinvested. I think stakeholders do a tremendous amount of work in terms of really driving to the legislators how important that investment is. And otherwise, we do have a 25% set aside in the 9% NOFA funding for federal rent-assisted preservation. We have all preservation, including portfolio preservation, eligible within our small project NOFA, which is a rural investment as well. I forgot to list here our home NOFA this year. We have dedicated exclusively towards preservation. Again, and that's the NOFA where we have the 5-point category deliberately just for those that are located in truly rural communities. And then we've just launched, Oregon has an affordable housing tax credit, which is a lender credit that allows up to 4 percentage point interest rate reduction for loans supported with that credit. And for those affordable housing projects where there is connected, 25% or more of the units have rent assistance, you don't have to do the pass-through on that. So you actually get a financial benefit to it. So it allows you to get that debt a lot cheaper. If it's a traditional, without rent assistance connected to it, if it's a tax credit project, that you do have to pass through the savings that you benefit from that. But so it's less of a financial investment and more of a way to be able to deeper skew rents within the projects. But for rent assisted portfolio preservation has been a really valuable tool in terms of helping to stimulate preservation and offset those costs. And so we did just launch this pool with 250 million in OHCC loan amounts that are specifically targeted towards preservation. And I don't remember if there's anything else. And I think with that, I think that's all I've got to kind of cover if there's questions.
Yeah, thanks, Natasha. I really appreciate that overview and that insight into what you're doing and why and what has gone a little bit awry in 2020, which we've all been dealing with, how to restructure as certain things happen. But definitely losing that source or having that source swept was a real critical, had real critical impact on that work last year or this coming year. There was a question, Dave Ferrier asked a question. You mentioned when you're talking about rural definitions that there were some times when the rural definition just wasn't working with where you needed to put dollars. So if he was asked if you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, it's I think the places on it, the places where so we have, and I don't know them off the top of my head, but there's some counties that initially have not been targeted or designated as MSA counties and then become designated as MSA counties. And there's at least one, if not two counties where that's happened. And so there's communities, that had, are 20,000 or 25,000 people in them. When they had not been designated as MSA counties, they were rural, and then they switched and then feel like, wait, now I'm competing against Portland. I'm really not Portland. And so that dynamic is really difficult to manage. And then I think similarly, it's largely when, it's when we have the smaller communities happen to be in really large counties that have touch points with truly metropolitan areas. But they might be 50, 60 miles from those communities and aren't bedroom communities. And, I can't look at them in the face with and really believe that I'm going to tell them, no, you're really urban, but because it's not the same thing. And so I think those are the places where I think as this definition and relying upon it has been really helpful in terms of having some predictability, but that it needs to be reevaluated at periods of time, so that we can better calibrate where those kind of population thresholds go as all of the communities are growing in size. I think we need to evolve that definition as well.
Definitely. I think it's amazing how much time we can spend talking about the definition of rural, but it does directly really impact how resources get allocated, especially as we create set-asides and ways to try to rebalance the scales with that happens and make sure there's no adverse consequences of that. So I really appreciate us all spending some time really thinking about it, because it is a necessary consideration. We got a question from Shelley on projects in Oregon that are on tribal trust land. What fund sources are you using to support those projects specifically?
Yeah, for the most part, we encourage all of our fund sources to be available to investments on tribal trust land. I think so within our 9% tax credit, we have that set aside. So have invested 9% and 4% tax credits there. We've been able to use our fees collected from document recordings to invest in tribal properties as well. Are trying to do more deliberate engagement with each of those tribal communities to understand what the needs and interest is, where that confidence level is. I think certainly there's some that have pursued more aggressively or more in partnership than others, and just really wanting to make sure that they understand that there's a place at the table to be able to engage and have those conversations. We do in Oregon are using, and this is unique, I think, to Oregon, we have the funding source for our LIFT program is our Article 11 Q bonds from the state. And those are specific resources that really are established, I think in the purest sense, for state investments. And so they most traditionally would be used for state infrastructure projects, or where the state is building a building for offices or something like that. But we've found an avenue to be able to use them for affordable rental housing development, but the state needs to have real ownership and operational controls within all of those documents and processes. And so I think we have identified that those are not a great fit for doing investment on tribal trust land. And so in those cases where there are projects proposed that are score well enough to get funded and all of that, we've essentially just had deliberately replaced those funding sources to not rely on that strange Q bond requirement, but instead use our most flexible resources and just have that in our strategy for doing so, to make sure there's not a barrier.
Yeah, I think it's important that you point out infrastructure. There actually was a question I'd missed from earlier in the chat that was talking about really in rural areas struggling sometimes with water and sewer and other infrastructure that's needed as you build housing and maybe more increasingly rural space. So really knowing that that's a need as we continue to do work and development in rural communities.
Yeah, I will say, I think that in particular for rural Oregon, and I think one of the things that, and we ask, you want to get as much leverage as you possibly can from resources, but I think relying on rural communities to waive system development charges to offset the costs of all of the needed infrastructure for adding to population in these communities is terribly problematic, in particular for rural communities that haven't been able to invest in those infrastructures for so long, and so asking that to be kind of sidestepped is problematic. And I think we've seen some efforts in the legislature over the years to try to find ways to offset that investment for rural areas, but I haven't seen anything that's moved forward. But it is something that we're continually, I'm trying to like have that nuance really appreciated when we're trying to look toward, you know, how can you prioritize that kind of leverage? And I think the way that at this point, it really manifests more in terms of where we set the per unit caps. And so in rural areas, I would set them higher because I don't expect there is a requirement that you would have that all of those kind of more levers within it. But in urban areas where they might have their own local resources or their own home funds or their own, all of those kinds of things, and arguably a little bit better ability to waive things like SDCs.
Yeah, no, I think that's super important and something to think about. I know Washington has also discussed the need to like have different caps in rural communities because the expenses are different for those communities as well. And I know as I've done some technical assistance in Alaska, infrastructure, water and sewer can become exceptionally expensive and really put pins in projects that don't get to move forward. So appreciate us all taking that lens. Super appreciate your time, Natasha, for presenting today and, you know, for being part of this work and a meaningful part of this work as we go forward with the Preservation Academy. I'm excited to be partnering with OHCS in that space as we continue to really work to build more pipelines for preservation and rural communities in the state and in the region. So with that, I am going to release you from your pen and I am going to move to introduce Eric Stephens. Eric is the team lead for both the Troubled Assets and Servicing Team 1 for USDA's Rural Development Multifamily Housing Field Operations Division. He will tell you a bit more about what that means. Prior to taking that position in October of 2020 under the realignment, Eric worked for the Rural Development Washington State Office. So many of you will recognize Eric as a familiar face. And there he oversaw new construction, farm worker housing, multifamily housing transfers, in the eastern part of the state. Eric is based in Wenatchee, Washington, and my apologies if I did not say that as a Washingtonian would say it. And prior to joining RD, he worked for Banner Bank's Commercial Division. So Eric, I will cede the stage to you.
All right, thanks, Robin. And yes, that is correct. It is Wenatchee, Washington. Great job on that. So first and foremost, I wanted to say thanks on behalf of USDA Rural Development to Robin and the staff over at Enterprise for pulling this together. I know we've done this in other states and regions across the country, and it has been greatly appreciated. And I've heard wonderful things about it, and I look forward to what comes out of this in the Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Alaska region. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about our programs here at USDA Rural Development with regards to multifamily. I'm going to talk about our portfolio, and I'm also going to talk about the realignment. So if we can go ahead and advance to the first slide, that would be great. Quick agenda here where we're going with everything today. Kind of outlined that already, but I also am going to dive a little bit into our portfolio. We're a little bit unique in the preservation world, where other funding agencies are really looking to preserve the assets that USDA Rural Development funded in some cases 30 to 50 years ago, and we're looking to keep those in these communities and functioning as affordable housing moving forward. All right, next slide. Quickly on the agency itself, I will take a few minutes to just highlight what we do here at Rural Development. We are the main economic development arm of USDA for rural America. USDA Rural Development administers on any given year between 40 and 50 unique programs for the department. we focus in on three main business lines. The first one is housing. We have both a single family and of course our multifamily housing, which we'll be talking a lot about today. We also have our rural utility line where we have water and waste programs, where we fund communities to have safe drinking water. We also have our rural utilities programs, which is a predecessor to the old rural electric programs that continues to advance that mission that was started many decades ago, but has now expanded into broadband delivery, which is so critical for our rural communities that they remain connected with the same technological assets that our urban areas have. We also then move on to our community facilities programs, where we fund things such as hospitals, police stations, fire trucks, ambulances, food banks. There's really a wide breadth of things that we can do with that program. Traditionally, our agency has funded economic development with direct funding from the U.S. Treasury. While we still provide direct funding, all of our programs now offer a guaranteed component to them, where we offer a guaranteed product to our partners in the private lending institutions. And that is really starting to become one of our cornerstones of program delivery for the agency in rural America. All right, next slide. So we're going to dive in and talk about multifamily housing programs. And I think it's really important that we kind of set the stage of what multifamily or RDs programs really are all about. They are a little bit unique. I know today we've talked a lot about, or folks have talked a lot about the rural definition. Yes, we are one of those funding agencies that has a very defined rural definition. But in the regards to multifamily housing preservation, any property that has already been established remains in the program. So it doesn't really apply unless we're looking at new funding for our properties. But in general terms speaking, the agency has maps that delineate which communities are in or urban areas are in, can be funded, and which ones are out. But generally speaking, towns and communities right around the 20,000 mark is when things start to fall out of eligibility. But of course, across all of our programs, there is some variability in that. With regards to multifamily programs, we really have two main programs inside that the agency has funded over the last 40 to 50 years. I'm going to start out just delineating a little bit about the Section 515 program. That is our family and elderly disabled housing. These were all direct loans. The heyday of the program was in the late 70s and early 80s. These loan terms ranged anywhere from 30 to 50 years in length. The properties were eligible for something that was called interest credit subsidy, which was another layer of subsidy that the agency provides to the owners to bring the real interest rate on the loans down to 1%. The idea here is to ensure maximum affordability for those units that are not covered by rental assistance. Just like other funders, the agency has income limits. The income limits are developed by the agency based on very low, and moderate incomes. While they follow, generally speaking, HUDs, they are different, but that's getting at pretty much the same thing. Additionally, in addition to our family properties, we also have properties that serve elderly and disabled folks, and they really function the same way with just the additional restrictions to them. I do want to bring everybody's attention to the Section 514 and 515 domestic farm labor housing portfolio that we have in these 4 states, and that program also. A lot of times when we talk about rural development's portfolio, everyone focuses in on the 515 portfolio, which is the bulk of the portfolio, and we'll look at that in a little bit. But we also do have a domestic farm labor housing program that actually does allow for new construction and is currently open accepting applications. These are direct loans that are 33 years in length and are underwritten at a 1%. And normally they also will come with grant funding. to house domestic farm labor, domestic farm laborers. We have some very unique restrictions on who can live at those properties. You need to be a U.S. citizen or legal resident. We've recently opened that up to expand into the H-2A program. We can move on to the next slide. So those are the two lending programs that we've had, and the program that everybody is interested in is the Section 521 rental assistance program. And this is where the agency provides ongoing funding to the properties based on the need of the tenant. In a nutshell, we provide, we backfill, so a tenant only has to pay 30% of their adjusted income, and the agency provides the remaining balance on the rent. So that is the difference between 30% of their income and the established basic rent for the unit. This is incredibly valuable and is the big ongoing commitment that the agency makes to rural communities. And this is by far the largest direct outlay that the agency has. Last year, it was about $1.4 billion in rental assistance that we provided to rural communities across the United States. The key is to remain eligible, the property to remain eligible for this program, they must have a 514 or 515 loan. And so that means preserving those properties becomes super critical. Next slide. Now we've kind of set the stage of what our portfolio, what programs, main programs our portfolio has. I did want to take a few minutes to give some descriptive demographics and characteristics of the portfolio across the 4 states that are participating. So in general, on the screen, I have broken down by Section 515, our family/elderly/disabled housing, versus our 514, 516 housing by state. Couple of things that I wanted to point out to folks is our properties on average are actually quite small. Our family properties are looking to be anywhere from 25 to 35 units in size, and our farm labor housing properties are anywhere from 27 to 34 across the region. Average across the region is 30 units, which is right in line with the national average of 31. Additionally, our housing stock really skews towards 1 and 2 bedroom units, which I know is a little bit different than we see from other funders. You can see the raw data there on the number of units. Almost, I think when I did the math earlier, it's about 80 to 90% of all of our housing stock is 1 or 2 unit sizes. Next slide, please. This slide, just to kind of keep going down demographics so we all have an understanding of who lives in rural development finance properties. This outlines not only the number of tenants and co-tenants, this is not the total number of household members at 22,000 for the region, but simply the number of tenants and co-tenants. And it also looks at their income, along with the number of rental assistance units and their income. In regards, when we're looking at our tenants that are assisted with rental assistance, on average, they're coming in right at about $12,000 to $13,000 of their adjusted annual income, which works out to be right around $1,000 a month. And about 80% of all of our units are covered with rental assistance. So as you're looking at your state that you might be working in, you can see that there's a lot of variability with this amongst the 2 programs and amongst the states. Next slide. Finally, with regards to tenants, I did want to give everyone just an idea and kind of a lay of the land of average rents. These are the average rents for the units across the states, across both programs. There is quite a bit of variability with Alaska coming in at the highest, followed up by Washington, Oregon, and then Idaho. But on average, we're looking at about $678 is the basic rent at our properties across the country, or excuse me, across the region. I've also provided some breakdown of our overburdened tenants to give you guys kind of an indication of where things stand. When you're thinking about preservation, we're almost always looking at bringing in third-party funders. They bring in additional restrictions with them, and thinking about you know, rents and being able to raise rents always is a key component of that. So I really, this slide is really an attempt to help you guys to understand where we're looking at things. I did find it interesting that Alaska doesn't have any overburdened tenants. That was a little tidbit that I learned pulling this together. I also wanted to let you all know that right at the bottom of the screen, you're going to see a hyperlink. All of this information that I have just provided on the screens is available to the public out under our ULs. We provide this data once a year. It's our annual summary of properties. There's additional data in that UL. It's about 40 or 50 pages long. And anyone that's looking at doing preservation or development in these states, I highly recommend that you take a look at that, and it will really help you to kind of dive into the data and understand both demographics and income of where our folks in the properties that RD helped develop all those years ago really stand. All right, we can move on to the next slide. No preservation conversation would be complete if we didn't talk about maturing mortgages. And I know Robin alluded to this a little bit earlier in her presentation, but I did want to make sure that you had the data for the states that are in this region, so that you could really see how this breaks down. As Robin indicated, it really is about the 2027 timeframe that things do start to amp up in terms of portfolio runoff here at RD. And there's a couple of reasons for this. One is originally loans were written at a 50-year term. That program really kicked into high gear, as I said earlier, in the late 70s, early 80s. So those are coming up. Additionally, we looked at we changed terms to a 30-year loan in the 90s. And so those two things kind of are colliding at the late 2020s and early 2030s to have runoff in our portfolio. But I do say that, I have been involved here in Washington State for several years through our partners, either at Commerce here in Washington State or using some of the maturing mortgage tools that we have here with the agency. We really have been able to forego most of these properties from leaving the portfolio. But these are the counts that are at risk. This also is all public data. And if we flip to the next slide, all of this data that was on the last slide, along with all of the descriptive statistics about the actual properties themselves, can be found on this website under the multifamily housing program exit data. This is a data set that is updated, I believe, once a quarter for the agency. The last time it was updated was at the end of December. If you're looking at doing preservation with any RD property across the country, this really should be your first stop to look at this data. It provides things like the location, the number of units, how much rental assistance, the unpaid mortgage balance, when our records, the agency's records, are showing that we think the property is going to exit the portfolio. So there's a lot of good information for those of you that are out there looking to do these types of things. You really should take a look at this. Like I said, the most recent set of data is from December, so it's pretty current. And then the last thing that I wanted to draw your attention to on this data set screen is the property assignments by region. We're going to talk about communication here with the agency in just a second, but this is the spot where you can find out which property is assigned to which specialist. This was activated after we did the reorganization in October, and this is updated right now. We've been updating it at least once a month, if not more often, as we work to sort out and move the portfolio around, not only within the Western region, but across the country. If we can move on to the next slide, please. All right, so I touched on reorganization a little bit. For those of you that have worked with RD for years, we went through a major reorganization in October of 2020. We went away from the state model where staff responded up to the state, and we had a state program director for multifamily and a state director that was over the state. For multifamily, that was replaced in October for all states with a nationalized organization structure that is regionalized. And we divided the agents, or excuse me, not the agency, but the multifamily operations into 3 divisions. We now have a field operations division, which I am part of. We have a production and preservation division, which handles our underwriting and application intake division. And then we have also an asset management division, which really focuses in on policy and provides support to the other 2 divisions on policy matters and portfolio performance. The field operations division is staffed, is the largest division and is staffed with the loan servicers. And they should always be your first point of contact if you have any questions, especially if they're servicing questions, or if you're looking at preservation and need additional information about the properties that is above and beyond what you can get off of the public website. They would be your first point of contact for that. I already outlined where you can find their information, but for here in the West, our regional director is Becky Meyer, who's also listed on the screen here, but we're divided into actually 5 servicing teams. I put 4 of the 5 servicing teams up here. We have teams 1, 2, 3, and 4. I've highlighted the states that we're focusing in today. You would be for Idaho and Oregon. I'm the team lead for that team. For anything in Alaska, Nate is the team lead for that, and Washington is Melissa. Field operations division is committed to having staff in each state. We have local field staff in all of our states, with the exception of right now of Alaska. We are actively working to recruit and fill that. It's actually open right now, to get a multifamily servicer up there so that we still remain that local touch that we had prior to reorganization. The 5th team is also the troubled assets team, which if you're looking at a property that is definitely on the problem side, I am also the team lead for that. And I would be the contact for that also. Any of the team leads you can reach out to at any time, and they would be more than happy to help you. Finally, if you have specific questions with regards to underwriting, or you're ready to submit an application, then we need to flip over to our production and preservation division. They're staffed over there to handle all of the underwriting needs of folks. And they have a general email box for the West, which is listed on your screen. It's constantly staffed. Please feel free to reach out to them, and they will be able to answer specific questions and technical questions about the underwriting side of things, or if you need to submit your application for a transfer. But by all means, please always feel free, if you don't know where to go, to reach out to the field operations division, and we will be more than happy to assist you. If we could flip to the next slide, I will. All right, so the very last thing that I wanted to highlight real quickly, I know as we're closing into noon here in Washington and 1 in our mountain states, is that Gov Delivery. If you've been around the agency, you probably, in multifamily in the last 3 or 4 months, you probably have heard about Gov Delivery, but I would be remiss in my duties if I did not highlight it. This is the primary tool that the agency is engaging with our borrowers, our management companies, and those that are looking to do development deals with the agency. Gov Delivery is really our one-stop shop for pushing out updated information, whether it's regard to changes with COVID, unnumbered letters, regulation changes, those kinds of things. Gov Delivery, I highly recommend that you sign up for it so that you can stay abreast of the changes. We're also pushing out structural changes through the reorganizational process, also go out through this way. The web link there is on the screen, along with the instructions of how to register for that. With that said, I did want to say again, thank you to Enterprise on behalf of the agency. We really do appreciate you having us involved with this. I know we will be in future discussions also. And I'll turn it back to you, Robin. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. This is I think this has been a really helpful to give us kind of context and bring us regionally after we've gotten to go kind of specifically dive into a couple of states. So there are a few questions that have come up in the chat. One thing I do want to point out, if you take a look at the chat, a lot of folks had some conversation about the infrastructure. And so if you're interested in hearing more about that or seeing more about that, please look at the chat. And then Rob also just shared a link because the Collins Foundation, which is one of our sponsors, has a, but also the Memorial Trust funding opportunities are both open in the state of Oregon, and those could be gap sources. So anyway, as we get into questions specifically, Eric, there are a few questions. One is, how often do USDA loan prepayments happen?
That's a good question. Right now in that 4 region, we probably have between probably a dozen and 2 dozen prepayments out of the 600 plus properties. So, you know, it's really up to the borrower, but they do happen from time to time. And that also is starts a whole chain of events that can be open to nonprofits for preservation. I recommend, if you're not already registered, to register for the USDA PIC system, which will provide you an automatic notification if the prepayment process makes it to the 6-month sale period.
Okay. Oh, I see something popped up in the Q&A. Are there any limitations for when a current owner may apply for prepayment? This is coming from Marty at ORF.
Yeah, there is prepayment limitations. The loan, if they're made after the early 90s, they're not eligible for prepayment based off of how we crafted our deeds of trust and our RUCs at that point. So they've got to be prior to that. And so that gap, that pool of loans is closing as things mature and run off or refinance.
Great, thanks. And it looks like Larry shared some insights on the amount of RD, saying RD has been losing multifamily units at about 5,000 per year annually, I guess, over the past couple of years. So anyway, that's some insight from Larry on the in the chat that he submitted. I would also like everyone to know that you can always raise your hand if that's easier and you want to be able to talk directly. And in light of having new questions come up, I did have a question about the overburdened rent, Eric.
Yeah.
And is that for the units that are not subsidized? Is that where you're getting that overburden amount, or where does that amount come from?
Yeah, that's a excellent question. So anyone that's on rental assistance by definition would not be considered overburdened because they're paying 30%. So those are individuals that are paying more than 30% of their income and are not on rental assistance. The slide does break down the severity of it. We break it into 3 categories: 30 to 40%, 41 to 50%, and then greater than 51% of their income. And again, that's all in that data set in the UL, the annual fair housing occupancy report that the agency pushes out usually around the November timeframe each year.
Okay,
So
and UL meaning unnumbered letter, right?
That is correct. I'm sorry about that. Yes.
No, we're all guilty of that acronym speak. So then Stephanie also mentioned that loss of units can be from prepayment, mortgage maturity, which I think both you and I, Eric, covered a bit, and then foreclosures, which just get lost for that risk. So I do not see any other direct questions. I did share the link to get to that multifamily list for inventory. I think that's huge, and we'll be getting into that a little bit more in our next session. And next session, Stephanie Virgin from your team will also be talking a bit about how some of this plays out directly as we're looking at transfers and just the actual 515 product, is how it functions. in a little bit more detail. I also see that my colleague Adrian shared with everyone the survey. I'd really appreciate that everyone link to that survey and take the survey. And there have been multiple questions about whether or not Eric's slides and the slides of others will be shared with them after, just because we're all curious and interested in getting to that data or following those links and those resources that you were able to share, Eric. So yes, the answer is you will get, there will be a recording of this, and the PowerPoints will be zipped up as one whole PowerPoint for DAC and will be available after for those who attended this session. So we are right at the top of the next hour, the bottom of the previous hour. I want to give a thank you to all of the folks who participated as speakers today, everyone who participated just being here and listening to this conversation. Those of you who are tremendous resources and who know a lot about this, who took time to be here today, I really appreciate as well, and contributed in the chat and in Q&A. Thank you so much. Our next session, as was asked, is going to be April 14th. We'll be doing some deeper look at the RD portfolio in this region with folks from the USDA multifamily housing team and with our technical assistance providers, Larry Anderson and Marty Miller and his team at ORF. So really looking forward to the rest of the sessions. Adrian will also provide a link to the rest of the session registration in the chat. And with that, I will bid you all farewell. Thank you.